Chapter 1. The Breaking Point. Thomas Blackwood's weathered hands curled around the rim of his coffee cup, steam rising like morning mist over the Montana plains. Dawn had just broken over his 1,000 acres land paid for in sweat and solitude. 53 years on this earth, 30 of them alone on this ranch since his wife Sarah passed in childbirth, taking their future with her. The loss had hardened him like leather left too long in the sun. Mr. Blackwood. Eliza stood in the doorway, her slight frame silhouetted against the gathering daylight. She'd been his cook for 8 months now, quiet, efficient, with eyes that never quite met his woman who moved through his house like a ghost afraid of disturbing the living. "Coffee's fresh," he said, the words falling between them like stones in still water. She nodded, moving to the iron stove. The way she winced when reaching for the skillet didn't escape him. Neither did the careful way she favored her left side, or how she'd taken to wearing high-collar dresses despite the August heat. "Expecting any visitors today, sir?" Her voice barely carried across the kitchen. "Just Patterson with supplies." Thomas watched her hands tremble slightly as she cracked eggs into the pan. "You feeling all right, Eliza?" "Just fine, Mr. Blackwood." The lie hung between them, as obvious as the bruise poorly concealed by powder at her temple. He'd noticed things. The weekly visits from her husband who'd leave her quiet for days. The muffled sounds from her cabin at the edge of his property. The way she startled at sudden movements. Thomas had minded his business wasn't a man's place to interfere between husband and wife. So the thinking went. The eggs sizzled in the pan. Outside, the windmill creaked its endless circle, pulling water from the depths. Thomas had built this place from nothing, a sanctuary from a world he'd stopped trying to understand after the war. After Sarah need to check the north pasture fence, he muttered, rising from the table. "Patterson should be here around noon." Eliza nodded without turning. "I'll have lunch ready." Noon came and went. Thomas returned to find Patterson's wagon in the yard, but the house silent, too silent. "Elisa," his voice echoed through empty rooms. He found her on the kitchen floor, crumpled like discarded paper. Blood from her split lip had dried on the floorboards. Her breathing came shallow, face mottled with bruises, fresh and yellowing layers of hurt, like geological strata. Patterson knelt beside her. "Found her like this when I arrived. No sign of who did it, but—" He didn't need to finish. Thomas felt something crack inside him, not sudden like ice in spring, but slow and deliberate, like a tree finally giving way to an axe that had been chipping at it for years. "Help me get her to the spare room." They carried her slight form up the stairs that hadn't felt a woman's tread since Sarah. Thomas watched as Patterson's wife, Mary Hood, come along for the supply run tended to Eliza's wounds. "This isn't the first time," Mary whispered, her fingers gentle on Eliza's bruised ribs. "Or the 10th. Her husband?" Thomas asked, though he already knew. Mary nodded. "That's been happening since they married. Town knows it. Sheriff does nothing, says it's family business." The words stoked something in Thomas that had lain dormant for decades. Not rage exactly, something colder, more resolute. "She left him last month," Mary continued. "That's why she took the position here. But he found her." Thomas stood at the window, watching dust devils dance across his land. This ranch had been his escape, his fortress against a world he couldn't control. Now that world had breached his walls. "She can't go back," he said finally. "She has nowhere else," Mary replied. Thomas turned, the decision settling into his bones like an old ache finding its home. "She has here." That night, Thomas sat on his porch, Winchester across his lap. The Montana stars pricked the darkness like distant lanterns. He thought of Sarah, of promises made, of the child they never had. He thought of war, of men who believed ownership extended to flesh and spirit. In the spare room, Eliza slept fitfully, guarded by Mary, who'd insisted on staying until morning. In town, a man might come looking for his wife. And beyond town, other women carried bruises beneath their sleeves. Behind their smiles, as land stretched before him, 1,000 acres of possibility. More space than one man needed. More protection than one man deserved. By morning, Thomas Blackwood's mind was set with the certainty of sunrise. His ranch would remain his fortress, not just for himself anymore, but for those who needed walls between themselves and the men who believed breaking things made them whole. The decision felt like setting down a burden he hadn't known he carried. For the first time since Sarah died, Thomas Blackwood knew exactly what his land was meant to be. Chapter 2. The line in the dust. The morning painted the Montana sky in watercolors, pale blues bleeding into pinks and golds. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a coffee cup gone cold. He hadn't slept. The night had passed in a vigil, his mind carving out plans like a river reshaping its banks after a flood. Mary Patterson appeared in the doorway, exhaustion dragging at her features. "She's awake, fever's down." Thomas nodded. "Will she heal?" "Her body will, Mary," replied the unspoken. Hanging between them, the floorboards above creaked to Eliza taking careful steps. Thomas rose, poured fresh coffee, set water to boil. Simple tasks anchoring him to a world suddenly tilted on its axis. "That husband of hers will come," Mary said, her voice low. "Men like him always do. Let him." The words settled in the room, like dust after a stampede. Thomas had killed men during the war not with hatred but with the cold certainty of necessity. He'd buried that part of himself in the rocky soil of his ranch. Now he felt it stirring, like something hibernating. Too long. There's a line. Mary always has been. Some men just need reminding where it's drawn. Mary studied him, this solitary man whose reputation in town spoke of stubborn independence rather than kindness. You surprise me, Thomas Blackwood. Been surprising myself since yesterday. He glanced toward the ceiling. She have family somewhere safe. None that would stand against him. Her father passed last spring. Mother's been in the ground 10 years. Mary wrapped her shawl tighter. Town's not safe either. Sheriff Benton and her husband served together in the army. Drink together most Saturdays. Thomas absorbed this, adding it to his mental calculus. Then she stays here. And when James Holloway comes for his wife with the law behind him, Thomas met Mary's gaze, something ancient and immovable in his eyes. This is my land, my rules. By midday, Eliza had made her way downstairs, moving with the careful deliberation of the deeply wounded. Her face a canvas of yellows, purples, and angry reds told a story Thomas had chosen too long to ignore. Mr. Blackwood, she began, her voice a whisper. I need to return to town. If James doesn't find me at home, you're not going back, Thomas said. The words flat as the horizon. Tears welled in Eliza's swollen eyes. He'll come here. He'll let him come. You don't understand what he's capable of. Thomas stood, crossed to the window. In the distance, dust from the road caught the sunlight. When I came back from the war, I couldn't sleep indoors. Too many walls, too much quiet. I'd lie out there. He pointed to a flat stretch near the creek, watching stars wheel overhead, listening for danger. Took 3 years before I could sleep in a bed again. He turned to face her. Some wounds don't show, Eliza, but I recognized the look of someone fighting a war inside themselves. She sank into a chair, hands trembling. What would you have me do? Stay heal after that? He shrugged. Your choice. The afternoon stretched long, filled with the ordinary tasks that defined ranch life, feeding livestock, mending equipment, watching the sky for weather. Thomas worked methodically, finding comfort in routine while his mind wandered unfamiliar paths. Mary had returned to town with Patterson, promising silence but preparation. Thomas knew how gossip traveled in small communities faster than wildfire, twice as destructive. By sundown, half the county would know Eliza Holloway was at Blackwood Ranch. The dust on the horizon appeared just before sunset, a single rider pushing his horse hard across the plains. Thomas watched from the porch, shotgun resting across his lap, not raised but present. James Holloway dismounted in a fluid motion that spoke of youth and anger. 30 years to Thomas's 53, with the coiled energy of a man who solved problems with his fists. His eyes darted from Thomas to the house behind him. Blackwood, he nodded, all false civility. I've come for my wife. She's not available. To you. Holloway's smile didn't reach his eyes. That's not how marriage works, old man. She's my property by law. Not on my land, she isn't. The younger man's hand drifted toward his holstered pistol. Don't make this difficult. Eliza's confused. Needs a firm hand. You understand? I understand plenty. Thomas remained seated, seemingly at ease. I understand a man who can't control his temper isn't fit to control anything else. You harboring my wife Blackwood, that's against the law. Interesting. Choice of words. Harboring like she's a fugitive. Thomas's voice remained level. I'm offering shelter to someone who needs it. Been doing that for strays and broken things most of my life. Holloway's face darkened. She'll tell you stories. Eliza's got a wild imagination. Prone to accidents, to clumsy woman. Those bruises weren't accidents. That's between husband and wife. Thomas finally stood unhurried. Not anymore. The change in Holloway was immediate, the veneer of civility cracking to reveal the rage beneath. His hand flew to his gun. You're making a mistake. Old man Sheriff Benton will back me. The law's on my side. Maybe in town, Thomas acknowledged. But we're not in town. Holloway's eyes narrowed, calculating odds and angles. Not leaving without her. Yes, Thomas said simply. You are. The standoff stretched between them, taut as a wire. Behind Thomas, the door opened. Eliza stepped onto the porch, her bruised face a testimony that needed no words. James, she said, her voice stronger than Thomas had ever heard it. Go home. Holloway's face contorted. You don't give me orders, woman. Get in my damn saddle now. No. The word hung in the air between them, small but immovable. This is your last chance, Eliza. You come home now. We'll forget this foolishness. She shook her head. I am home. The motion was quick. Holloway, drawing his pistol in a practiced sweep. But Thomas was quicker, the shotgun raised and steady before the younger man could aim. That would be unwise, Thomas said, his voice soft as falling snow. Holloway froze, fury and calculation warring in his eyes. This isn't over, Blackwood. Not by a long shot. It is for today. Thomas didn't blink, didn't waver. Ride out, don't come back. Something passed between them, an understanding as old as conflict itself. For now at least, Holloway recognized the losing hand. He holstered his pistol slowly, mounted his horse with deliberate movements. You can't protect her forever, old man. Thomas nodded toward the horizon. Forever isn't my concern. Today is. As Holloway rode away, dust swirling in his wake, Thomas felt Eliza's presence beside him. Neither spoke for a long moment. He'll be back, she finally said. With the sheriff, maybe others, probably. Thomas lowered the shotgun. Got some time before that happens. Enough to prepare. Prepare for what? Thomas looked out over his land, the fences marking boundaries, the barn that could house twice the livestock but the empty cabins built for ranch hands he'd never hired. For more, he said simply. More like you. Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. 3 weeks passed like water through cupped hands. Autumn crept across the Montana landscape, painting the distant hills in rust and gold. Thomas Blackwood stood at the edge of his property, watching as the Patterson wagon approached, kicking up dust that caught the late afternoon light. 2 figures sat beside. Mary Patterson, women with straight backs and downcast eyes. The third woman lay in the wagon bed, a blanket pulled to her chin despite the mild day. Thomas removed his hat, running calloused fingers through gray-streaked hair. Didn't expect you back so soon, he called as the wagon drew near. Mary's face was grim beneath her bonnet. Couldn't wait. Clara here. She nodded to the woman beside her. Her husband came at her with a skinning knife last night. And Ruth, she glanced back at the woman lying in the wagon. Ruth needs somewhere her husband won't think to look. Thomas nodded, replacing his hat. No questions asked. That had become the unspoken rule of Blackwood Ranch. Eliza's got the east cabin ready, he said. The north one needs work, but it'll do for now. What had begun as shelter for one had quietly expanded. Word traveled in whispers between women, at church socials, market days, through laundresses and midwives, channels of communication invisible to the men who thought they controlled everything worth knowing. 3 cabins now housed women with stories written on their bodies. Thomas had built these structures years ago, intending them for cowboys and ranch hands he'd never gotten around to hiring. Now they've served a different purpose. These small fortresses of salvaged dignity. Eliza emerged from the main house, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. The bruises on her face had faded to memory, but Thomas noted how she still startled at sudden movements, still scanned the horizon for approaching riders. I'll show them to the cabins, she said, her voice steadier than it had been weeks ago. Thomas nodded, turning back to Mary. Sheriff been asking questions. Not directly. Mary gathered her shawl closer. But there's talk. Holloway drinks louder these days, makes threats. Sheriff listens, let them talk. Thomas helped unload meager belongings from the Wagana quilt here, a family Bible there. The sum of lives measured in what could be grabbed in haste. Later, smoke rose from 3 cabin chimneys as dusk settled over the ranch. Thomas sat on his porch nursing coffee laced with whiskey. Eliza joined him, her own cup steaming in the cooling air. Ruth was a schoolteacher, she said quietly. Clara made the finest lace in the county before. Thomas nodded. Before. That word contained worlds before fists and fear, before choices narrowed to endurance or escape. They'll find their way, he said. Land gives people room to remember themselves, and when the sheriff comes, when the husbands demand their property returned. Eliza's voice carried no fear now, only the practical concerns of a woman measuring threats. Been thinking on that. Double quotes. Thomas sipped his coffee. Legal papers, bill of sale. Eliza turned to him, confusion creasing her brow. This land, he continued, 1,000 acres, more than I need. Could sell parcels, small ones, enough for a cabin, a garden plot. Understanding dawned slowly across Eliza's face. You'd sell land to women with no money. Terms to be determined. Thomas shrugged. A woman who owns property has rights, a wife doesn't. Can't force someone off land they legally own. The idea had come to him gradually, taking shape like a sculpture, revealed by careful cuts. Sarah had taught him about contracts, about the power of words on paper. Before she died, she'd made him promise to use what she'd taught him. It had taken 30 years to understand what that promise meant. It won't be that simple, Eliza cautioned. Nothing worthwhile is. Thomas looked out over his land that had been his sanctuary, his burden, his penance. Now it could be something more. Dawn broke cold and clear the next morning. Thomas rode to town alone, a leather portfolio tucked inside his coat. The law office of Hammond & Sons stood at the edge of Main Street, a modest building that housed the only lawyer within 50 miles. Inside, William Hammond looked up from his desk, surprised at the rare visitor. Blackwood, what brings you to civilization? Thomas placed the portfolio on the desk. Need papers drawn up. Land parcels, 5 to start. Sales with special terms. Hammond's eyebrows rose. Selling off pieces of your kingdom. Just redistributing the boundaries. The lawyer opened the portfolio, scanning Thomas's careful notes. His expression shifted from curiosity to concern. These buyers all women, some married. That a problem? Hammond removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly. Legally, complicated. Practically, you're looking for trouble. Already found it, Thomas replied. Just giving it proper shape now. Sheriff Benton was in here yesterday, asking about property rights. Wife's claims. Hammond's voice lowered. Word is you're harboring runaways. women who should be under their husbands' roofs. I'm offering employment to those seeking it. What happens after working hours isn't my concern." The two men regarded each other across the desk, a chessboard of unspoken calculations. "These sales," Hammond finally said, "they'd need to be ironclad. And even then, some men won't respect paper." Thomas nodded. "I'm counting on that. You want them to challenge it." Understanding flickered in Hammond's eyes. "You're setting a trap." Thomas didn't confirm or deny. "Can you draw up the papers or not?" Hammond sighed, reaching for a fresh sheet. "Give me 2 days. And Blackwood, whatever game you're playing, be careful. Some men in this town, they don't lose gracefully." Thomas left the office as the town came to life around him. He felt eyes tracking his movements from the general store, the saloon, the sheriff's office. News traveled fast in small places, faster when it disturbed the natural order. At the edge of town, a familiar figure blocked his path. James Holloway stood beside Thomas's horse, one hand resting too casually on the saddle. "Blackwood," he nodded, false courtesy stretched thin. "Of a rage, quite the operation you're running." Thomas stopped several paces away. "Holloway, a man's entitled to his property." Holloway's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Bible says so. Law says so. I recall different readings of both." Holloway stepped closer. "Sheriff's been patient. I've been patient. That patience is running thin." Noted. Thomas moved toward his horse. "I'm not finished, I am." Thomas met the younger man's gaze. "Whatever you're planning, Holloway, remember this. Those women came to my land broken and afraid. They won't leave it the same way." Something dangerous flashed in Holloway's eyes. "That sounds like a threat, just an observation." Thomas mounted his horse. "Good day." As he rode from town, Thomas felt the weight of what he'd set in motion. Papers would be drawn, boundaries established. But paper burns, boundaries get crossed. The real protection would need to be something strong. Community forged in shared purpose. A family built not from blood but from the simple recognition of each person's right to wake without fear. Back at the ranch, smoke rose from 4 chimneys now. In the main house, Eliza moved with growing confidence. In the cabins, women spoke, in voices that grew stronger each day. And on the horizon, Thomas knew a storm was gathering. But for the first time in 30 years, he wasn't facing it alone. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. First frost painted the grassland silver, brittle as old memories. Thomas Blackwood stood on his porch in the pale dawn light, watching as 6 riders appeared on the horizon. The moment he'd been preparing for had arrived. With the inevitability of winter. Sheriff Benton led the procession, badge catching sunlight like a threat. Beside him rode James Holloway, face set in righteous anger. Behind them came 4 others, husbands come to claim what they believed was theirs by right and law. Thomas stepped inside the main house. "They're coming," he said simply. Eliza looked up from the stove, her eyes clear and steady. No longer the frightened woman who'd collapsed on his kitchen floor 2 months earlier. "How many?" "6 sheriffs included." She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll tell the others." While Thomas had been securing legal protections, Eliza had been building something equally important to a community bound by shared purpose. The women had organized themselves with the efficiency of those who understood that survival depended on preparation. Each had found her strength again, remembered the woman she'd been before. Fear became her constant companion. Thomas checked his shotgun, then set it aside. This battle wouldn't be won with weapons. He placed the leather portfolio on the kitchen table. 6 deeds, properly notarized, legally binding. William Hammond had delivered them 3 days ago with a warning. Paper only matters to men who respect it. The sound of hooves in the yard drew Thomas back to the porch. Behind him, doors opened across the property as women emerged from cabins, standing like sentinels, not hiding, not cowering, witnessing. "Blackwood," Sheriff Benton called, reining his horse. "We need to talk." Thomas descended the steps, stopping at the precise boundary where yard met open range. Sheriff Benton dismounted, adjusting his gun belt with practiced casualness. "This has gone on long enough. These men have come for their wives. Law's on their side." "Law's complicated," Thomas replied, "especially when it comes to property." Holloway spat into the dust. "She isn't property. She's my wife. Bible says she submits to me." "Bible says a lot of things," Thomas answered, "including how a husband should cherish his wife as Christ loved the church." "Don't recall Christ leaving Bruises. That's between man and wife," another writer interjected. "Not anymore." Thomas turned as Eliza approached, portfolio in hand. She passed it to him with a nod. "Sheriff," Thomas said, "I'd like to introduce the newest landowners in the county. Each of these women now legally owns the parcel her cabin stands on, sold at fair market value, terms recorded with the county clerk." Benton's expression shifted from confidence to calculation. "A woman can't own property without her husband's consent. A married woman, perhaps not," Thomas conceded, "but a woman filing for divorce can petition for separate property rights, which all of them have done." The riders stirred, muttering amongst themselves. Holloway's face darkened like a thunderhead. "This is a trick, legal sleight of hand." "It's the law," Thomas replied. "Same law you're hiding behind, cuts both ways." Sheriff Benton accepted the portfolio, flipping through the documents with narrowed eyes. "Hammond drew these up." Thomas nodded. Everything's in order. This doesn't change anything, Holloway snapped. Eliza is still legally my wife until a judge says otherwise. True, Thomas acknowledged. But she's also legally my tenant and employee. And you're trespassing on private property, hers and mine. The standoff stretched between them, tension vibrating like a plucked wire. Behind Thomas, more women had gathered, 7 now, standing shoulder to shoulder in a silent wall of solidarity. Sheriff Benton handed the portfolio back to Thomas, resignation settling across his features. Holloway, we need to regroup. These papers change things. Like hell they do. Holloway's hand moved to his holster. James, Liza's voice cut through the tension. It's over. Something in her tone, not fear, not anger, just calm certainty seemed to reach through Holloway's rage. He stared at his wife as if seeing a stranger. You think a piece of paper protects you? He asked, voice low. You think he will? Eliza shook her head. We protect each other now. The women behind her shifted closer, a living fortress. Thomas remained still, aware that this moment didn't belong to him. This was Eliza's victory to claim, her freedom to declaim. Sheriff Benton mounted his horse. Come on, Holloway, not today. For a moment, it seemed Holloway might refuse. Then, with a curse, he yanked his horse around. This isn't finished, he called over his shoulder. Yes, Eliza replied, her voice carrying across the yard. It is. They watched as the riders disappeared into the distance, dust settling in their wake. The women remained, shoulder to shoulder, until the horizon was empty once more. That evening, as lamps glowed in windows across the property, Thomas sat on his porch watching smoke rise from 7 chimneys now. Eliza joined him, offering a cup of coffee. They'll be back, she said. Different tactics. Next time, Thomas nodded. We'll be ready. It will never truly be over, will it? Some battles aren't meant to end, Thomas replied. Just to change who's fighting them, and how. Eliza smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. Sarah would be proud of what you've done here. Thomas looked up, startled. He rarely spoke of his wife, had mentioned her only once to Eliza. Mary told me, she explained, how Sarah taught you to read contracts, to understand the power of words. On paper, how you lost her before you could build the family you planned. Thomas turned his gaze back to the land, his land, their land now. Never thought family would look like this, he admitted. The best families are the ones we choose, Eliza said softly. The ones born from necessity and nurtured by choice. As darkness settled over Blackwood Ranch, Thomas felt something shift within him, a weight carried for 30 years finally finding its purpose. This wasn't the life he'd imagined with Sarah. It was something unexpected, something forged from brokenness and courage. His 1,000 acres, once a fortress against the world, had become a gateway to something greater. Not just a refuge, but a beginning.